time travel and GPS. That's fun. I've already kind of announced Larry and Mike. Larry is a co-host of Security Weekly since the very beginning. I have way too many pictures on my computer of Larry in various states of undress wearing a Linksys wart. Everyone has their hobbies. But Larry is one of the most brilliant wireless security researchers we've ever seen. Been an instructor with the SANS Institute for a long time. He's been an agent in Guardians for a long time as well. Learned a tremendous amount from Larry over the years. Almost anything weird, obscure, and brilliant comes through Larry, because everyone just kind of shares stuff with Larry. Larry is probably the nicest person in information security. And then Mike Poor, as I mentioned, is a big brother to me, founding member of the consulting firm in Guardians. And I keep saying this, and Guardians is the company that I hope BHIS can be. We keep trying to aspire to that level, and they keep trying to impress and amaze and succeeding at it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Larry and Mike. Take it away, folks.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Jinx. Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Sorry we couldn't be all doing this in person, but we will raise our virtual glasses to all of the attendees and to all of the Wild West Hacking Fest staff who are doing an amazing job and rolling with the punches. So thank you very much. I know, speaking for Mike, that we definitely appreciate the opportunity. Mike, what do you say? How about we dig right into it?
Yeah, it sounds great. I also just wanted to extend my own personal thanks to John, his amazing team. We've all been maintaining a lot of contact over the last month or so over this. Just to tell a little personal story, in 2003, I was working for SANS, and they sent me to teach at the SANS Singapore conference during the SARS epidemic. They had canceled the Hong Kong conference. That was kind of the outside of mainland China epicenter of the SARS epidemic. Then in Singapore, they decided to go ahead with it because their Ministry of Health was basically saying, yeah, we have 54 people, but they're all in quarantine and we're fine. Everything's good. I faced the prospect at the time. My wife and I, we were recently expecting at the time, for our son Max. I faced this daunting idea of getting flown into an epidemic with no real knowledge. At the time, we didn't really know anything about SARS other than it was spreading and it was deadly. That really impacted me tremendously. And it impacted SANS and a bunch of other training organizations. In lieu of that, SANS grew most of their remote training capabilities from that particular event. When John and I started talking about this and the BHIS staff, looking at this was definitely one of those, I don't know if it's going to work, but we probably really should go virtual for this. So I really appreciate everybody's understanding. In fact, tons of people that signed up for this particular event after it went virtual because all of a sudden they were able to attend. So thank you to everybody, all the attendees for showing up. BHIS, especially John and Velda, Jason and folks, all deserve a huge, huge air hug and round of applause, for pulling this off. So let's get into this, Larry. Who the hell are we?
Absolutely. So yeah, I was having a little issues with some slides here, but I think we got it fixed. So hey, now you can actually see stuff aside from the main screen there. So yeah, Mike, who the F are we?
I run in Guardians with my business partners. My main role comes in the form of consigliere, especially wartime consigliere, meaning when the shit hits the fan, that's usually when I engage the most. But after retiring from SANS 3 years ago, I've taken a very active role in managing the day-to-day operations of the company. My background is in intrusion detection and data analysis. I don't know about the expert there. Thank you, Larry, for the benefit of the doubt.
This is what happens when someone writes your intro.
Exactly. I like it. I've spent a good deal of my career as an educator and a public speaker. Over the past 3 years, I dove headfirst into the wonderful world of bladesmithing and swordsmithing. You might see a little As Seen on Forged in Fire. Let me know in Discord if you caught that episode. It was season 7, episode 19, the Pira episode. Lots of fun. This journey has really taken me to a lot of places, met wonderful people. Some of them overlap. We have Rob Decker, who was also, I think, on season 1 of Forged in Fire. He's an InfoSec consultant out of Delaware. Good friend of Larry's, great InfoSec practitioner and amazing bladesmith. I'm definitely a foodie and I love to cook. How about you, Larry?
I'm the Director of Research at Guardians and the Technical Operations Manager, helping the guys keep the wheels on the ground and providing resources and stuff to the folks, as well as helping come up with crazy ideas and start to potentially find ways to implement crazy ideas, very much like the subject of today's talk. I happen to love the Internet of Things, all sorts of wireless protocols, software-defined radio, and spend a lot of time both professionally and as a hobby doing those types of things. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, haven't gotten my Stormtrooper outfit put together yet, Mr. Kevin Johnson, but soon. And I also teach SANS Sec 617 for the SANS Institute. That is the Wi-Fi class, and I'm currently lead author with a good friend, James Leedy Vidal. Much like Mike, I also do have a bunch of other hobbies as well. Mike has been instrumental in getting me down the knife-making path and has been a mentor in that. I'm getting there. It takes some time. We've had carpenters in our family and engineers in our family, so I'd also say that I'm an amateur sawdust maker. In fact, I'd like to spend a little bit of time in the workshop every morning making some sawdust of some variety, and if it's not sawdust, it's some sort of metal dust as well. Very much to the wireless portion. I'm also a ham radio operator, and I don't nearly get as much time to devote to it as I would like, but now, figuring I was going to have to be on video to be doing this talk, I cleaned my office, and my office is actually like clean, and I can get to my ham radio, and maybe I'll actually turn that on every once in a while too. So thanks, John. Thanks for having us, and because now I have a clean office. So I think we're gonna have lots of fun today, and some of those crazy ideas get to be put in place for this one. Mike, it's time for us to dive in on some technical type of stuff, which is maybe a little unusual for a keynote. So clearly, based on the title of our talk, time travel and GPS ckery, we're very much dealing with some satellite navigation type of things. And we want to give everybody a little bit of technical background as to how some of these types of systems work at a high level. We don't want to make it too super technical. It's a keynote after all, but we want to illustrate this to illustrate some of the problems that we found and then sort of bring that to some of our conclusions. So the fundamentals for satellite navigation, effectively, we have a bunch of satellites for each of the various disparate systems in orbit at known position that are transmitting from space down to Earth an RF signal that has data encoded in that RF signal. It includes a pseudo-random code that we can now use to identify those transmissions. It includes the time of transmission from the satellite, otherwise known as the TOT, or the time of transmission, and its position orbiting the Earth at the time of transmission. So the satellite is effectively, all of the satellites are effectively telling us where they are and what time they were at. So where they were at what time. We receive these signals at our GPS receiver, whether it be our phone or some custom home-built thing or our sat-nav in our car, you name it. Once we receive that RF energy, we use that pseudo-random code to align the packet to begin to tell us where the start is, and then decode the rest of the information out of it, such as the time of transmission from the satellite, which then is compared to the time of arrival from 4 satellites. This gives us the ability to tell how far the distance has traveled based on the speed of light. We know the effective distance. It's told us where we are. We calculate how long it took to get here, gives us an effective distance from those satellites. With 4 satellites, we can now use that to gain some insight as to where we are on those planets by some effective triangulation. So that turns into the time of flight value, how long it took for that signal to get from the satellite to our receiver. And then we compare those with the time of transmission, times of arrival, and use those with the speed of light to tell us where we are on the planet. So effectively, we're using math and all sorts of other fun stuff. So we need a bunch of satellites and we need some equations to be able to determine distance based on the speed of light and the averages and the triangulation based on those different values for time of transmission to time of arrival to create time of flight. So lots of really interesting math, and yet math is absolutely hard, and Office products also suck for math equations. So lots of sort of detail here, but to make this really easy, the TLDR on satellite navigation, Space Force, math, and magic. I actually included Space Force as a joke when I was creating these slides, and turns out the US-based GPS satellite navigation system is actually now managed by the United States Space Force. So not so much of a joke after all. Satellites in space sending RF that we use to calculate the distance from that satellite to us for triangulation to be able to determine our location. We have multiple systems deployed with around the planet with similar math. It really was only able to dig up the math for GPS, but they are all using similar types of things with triangulation. They may be using different types of packet formatting and pseudo-random types of codes, but we have multiple systems and in various locations. So we have GPS here in the US. We have Galileo in Europe and a few other locations as well. There's also GLONASS, which is a Russian implementation of satellite navigation, which is all over the planet. And then there's a few smaller systems, Baidu for China, IRNSS specifically for India, and QZSS for Japan and the Asia-Oceania area to be able to cover Australia and New Zealand as well. The point being here is that all of these systems use similar types of math, do similar types of functionality for various places on the planet, and have multiple features. There's two abilities, one for civilian use, so unencrypted signals, and then the ability to encrypt packets based on a set of shared keys for military applications where they can do finer grained cation analysis by more accurately doing time of transmission and so forth as well. All of the various systems have multiple add-ons to do resolution enhancements. So all sorts of different types of abilities for us to improve these systems over the years and make certain of these resolution enhancements available for either civilian and or military applications. Because we also include the concept of time with satellite navigation from the time of transmission and so forth, it's also a very effective time source for time synchronization. And in many cases where an atomic clock isn't used, is used for time synchronization for various NTP servers. So we may be starting to allude as to where we can start doing some potential time travel. Mike, you're up.
So satellite transmissions are weak. That's a wonderful intro to the slide. The deal here is that satellite power generation capabilities are relatively low for what they are. These systems were designed originally for use by the military after a Japanese engineer essentially reverse engineered the signal. This became available essentially to the civilian use of GPS, what we have today. These transmissions themselves are relatively weak. They have to happen often on a continuous basis. These satellites are solar powered. Granted, they have a little bit better access and a little less cover than we do down here for solar power. Because of that, it really dictates a window of opportunity for people on the ground or people in low orbit to essentially transmit a stronger signal. The other thing to think about here is that in all of that math that Larry, so eloquently described, there was no authentication of that signal reception on the civilian side of things, right? So, you fire up your phone, you fire up a GPS handset, for example. I fire up the chart plotter on my sailboat, for example, and it's going to start receiving the signals, doing the math, calculating our position. And because of that, the fact that it's unauthenticated, it's coming from a signal transmission that is relatively weak and from far away, these can be interfered with. Right now, I want to point out over here, technically illegal, right? Licensed transmissions bans, meaning that by law, which of course only affects law-abiding individuals, but by law, we're not allowed to manipulate or spoof or transmit on these particular bands unless you have a license to do so. And because there's no method for this mutual authentication and the signals are weak and there's motivation to manipulate these signals, which I'll get into in a bit, what ends up happening is that as long as you can spoof that signal, that radio frequency signal, to the general location of where you are, it is relatively trivial to start manipulating the time as well as manipulating location data based on that. Right now, there are some mitigation technologies that do exist. They're very expensive to implement. They're certainly not for the casual user. For example, if you had a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that relied on GPS time signals, for example, then it would make sense to implement something to one, mitigate the problem, two, to try to detect any manipulations that are currently taking place. One thing I'd like to point out, kind of as a driver for us to start looking at this. One, there really weren't any civilian and certainly no open source projects that would allow you to actually detect the manipulation of these GPS signals. So that was a definite good motivation. The other thing is that those of you that have seen the wonderful movie The Hunt for Red October, I live right next on my sailboat, right next to the Hood Canal, which is essentially our version of Polyarny, right? So if the Kemper Peninsula here in the Northwest were to secede from the United States, I'm not suggesting it, they would be the third largest nuclear power on the planet. So that's where we keep our boomers over here on the Pacific side. And so regularly when we're sailing, we run across nuclear submarines that are above water, being escorted by Navy and Coast Guard. And so, based on some of the things that we'll discuss in a little bit, I started thinking, are they spoofing GPS? Are they spoofing AIS, which we'll talk about as well? Are they, in addition to all of this, and being up here next to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is one of the largest shipping channels in the United States. The side thing to that is that the U.S. Navy, out of Naval Air Station Whidbey, operates a large fleet of growlers that are outfitted with electronic warfare capability. And they've made part of the Olympics out here an electronic warfare range. So that was kind of a secondary motivation for me to really want to develop a system that would detect any kind of manipulation of these signals. It's definitely been an interesting project so far, and I really can't wait to see where it goes. Larry?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we talked about that potentially these signals are spoofable, and absolutely, it actually is fairly easy for us as civilians to spoof GPS with some readily available commodity hardware with the HackerF and some other software-defined radios, and some free open source software with GPS, SDR, SIM. Available for free and can spoof GPS over a short distance using the power of the HackerF. Now, of course, we could potentially make this larger with some amplifiers and so forth. Again, technically illegal to do so. If you're doing any experimentation, make sure you're being smart about this. Consider Faraday cages, consider direct connection from your devices via cable, and then still doing those in a Faraday cage. Again, be very careful with testing these types of stuff. Now, with the HackerF and some free open source software, we can spoof both location or time. So if a civilian can do that very inexpensively, why do we trust it? And then who really cares? Who's going to mess with it? I mean, maybe you just want to mess with it so that you can go get Pokemon and those types of things. But maybe there's some more larger applications for something outside of the civilian market and maybe into the military sector. And certainly a motivation and or those with significantly more funds or motivation, say nation states, have the ability to have more advanced capabilities and may be highly motivated to perform GPS buckery. So what happens when we start messing with GPS? Mike, you tell me.
Well, and we're speaking about GPS here, but what we're really talking about is any one of these global navigation satellite systems, have these inherent problems. So,
agreed. Apologies for using the term interchangeably.
Yes, when we first got into this, Larry and I are clearly still having problems with that. In that US, we think of GPS and GPS only. Outside of here, a lot of the experts in this field always refer to this as, GNSS. The things that we use to trust these things, huge financial systems, stock trading, for example. Where does it get its time, you might ask? Well, actually from a signal that's based off of this. Many years ago, I did a project looking specifically at NTP and started looking at taxi systems and all these other systems that use NTP to synchronize their time-based transactions. And then you start looking at things like the Bureau of Prisons. Or you start looking at large companies that rely on navigation and tracking. So, for example, your huge logistics and shipping organizations. You have, obviously, state and military things that are directly pulling stuff off of this. You've got, for example, we'll cover some of the things going on around the world in Russia and China and other places, and also in the United States. You have trucking companies that are tracking their truck drivers and their trucks across country with GPS, for example. Many other organizations and uses for using GPS other than just simple navigation. I say simple navigation as if it's a given, right? It's definitely something that is relatively easy to do on a simple level. The more complex kind of fuckery that you want to get into with GPS, for example, or any of the GNSS systems, obviously, your hardware and your power requirements go way up. But we'll look at a couple of those types of situations, right? But when you look at what happens when time changes, well, obviously, anything that is using time-based transactions, from your financial transactions, stock trading, and so forth, to airport luggage, passenger and flight tracking, and many other things, right? We've got issues with ICS, SCADA, and general the infrastructure Internet of Things uses, time-based signals for a lot of their stuff, including seeding of session credentials and other things as well. I've already mentioned financial systems reliant on that precise timing, and most of these systems, just to realize, are reliant on this, even though there's no authentication of signal, right? Which was one of those things that really blew my mind when we started looking at this. It's like, well, hold on a second. All of these disparate industries, if you will, are relying on a signal that has just inherent open trust built into it as a standard, for example. Systems that are connected to NTP or via WWVB, so radio transmission of these GPS time signals, for example. So pretty much all of your radio clocks across the United States are all essentially deriving their time out of a radio frequency server that is based in Colorado and sending that data out. So here we have a nice little quote from NIST. A hypothetical disruption to GPS could result in a $30 to $45 billion in economic losses over a 30-day period. So a tremendous amount of business requires GPS. I know from my side on the water, for example, that all of our shipping is almost entirely reliant on GPS or other global satellite navigation systems, right? But primarily GPS. So when Chinese ships are coming into U.S. waters, their autopilots for these cargo ships that are cruising along at 25 to 40 knots, they are basing their signal off of these satellites. So if, for example, that signal is skewed, bad things are going to happen. Some people have hypothesized, now this is a conspiracy theory hypothesizing exercise here, but we had two very specific events that happened in the Pacific in the realm of the South China Sea and between the South China Sea and the Sea of Japan, where large U.S. Navy boats went off course. One of them ran aground, the other, ran into another ship. So, and immediately following that, the U.S. Navy reactivated their celestial navigation courses as a requirement for anybody that's going to be driving one of those things. Now, it's kind of telling to me when the United States Navy decides that they want to go back to a sextant and a bunch of tables to determine where the location was on the planet. So one of the first kind of places where we started to see widespread global navigation satellite system spoofing and fuckery was out of the Russian Federation. So there's been an ongoing project that are between a group of engineers that are studying this problem. But this originally came out of fishing boats on the Black Sea, for example. They had a number of their boats go off course. They were noticing that their GLONASS receivers, for example, were varying widely, showing them on land and deviating from course. And they started to bring this data up to the news, and the news media would publish it and so forth. But what they uncovered was currently, as far as we know, the most sophisticated levels of satellite navigation system spoofing out there. So the Russians have been heavily involved for a number of different reasons. One, to protect their VIPs, right? They're very important Putins, right? And you've got a situation where they've seen this in Moscow. They've seen this around important events like the Sochi Olympics, for example. They've seen this around sensitive facilities, the military facilities and the like, and including one facility where it was originally built as essentially a palace for the Russian leadership. kind of a Camp David retreat on the ocean or on the sea. This reporting by these fishing captains essentially forced the public attention on what was going on. It had been going on in Moscow kind of for about a year and a half or two before it was noticed by the fishing captains. And it is currently an extremely active area. You can see from the slide that during these exercises, hundreds of ships, both civilian, military, fishing vessels, so kind of working vessels, all affected with false locations. Hopefully they were using their eyes and ears and nose as their primary senses of navigation, magnetic compass, and so forth. But I can tell you from a civilian standpoint, there are very few vessels out there that are constantly doing dead reckoning and doing course plotting on paper, even though it is still required in many locations. So, this allowed, the Russians to, one, develop extensive capabilities in this arena. Another active area that we see is Syria. Syria is a huge place for global navigation fuckery because, they're trying to protect their assets. They're trying to get our systems to go off course, for example. So, if you wanted to protect a specific location, you would essentially skew the global navigation position for that location so that if bombs like our JDAMs, for example, which enable essentially dumb munitions to act as smart munitions, they're using a constant tracking of a global navigation satellite system to hit its intended target. So if you change the position of target A to location B, for example, that JDAM, once it leaves the aircraft, is going to find its target at location B as opposed to location A. And in addition to that, provide essentially a bubble where they can essentially move positions, change positions, report false positions to a wide area, both on the ground and to low-level orbit, depending on the power requirements here.
Yep. Mike, a little bit on the technical side for some of the ways that they're rumored to be doing this. They're performing some RF jamming-based attacks from both mobile and fixed locations, effectively creating excess RF noise on the channels for the L2 and the L5 signal coming from those satellites, effectively forcing the receivers to fall back to the primary and use the primary of L1, which is quite easy to provide a spoof signal for. But you have all these signals that you can use, and now all of them go away except for one. And it's unauthenticated, potentially unauthenticated, and now you're just reliant on this one, which is now spoofed.
Yeah, absolutely. The actual technology that they're using, for example, or alleged to be using in Russia and on their operations is very sophisticated. But the base parameters is relatively simple, right? So it's a question of acquiring hardware and operating in a space that is currently illegal in the United States to operate under. Next, Larry. We've been shanghaied. So the same group that has been studying the global navigation satellite spoofing activity noticed that there was spoofing at the port of Shanghai. Now, they were doing a number of things. They were spoofing GPS signals. They were spoofing Baidu signals, which is their particular satellite navigation system. Also, there was alleged AIS signal spoofing. So AIS is the using of the VHF band to transmit location data and additional data about the vessels that are around you. So, for example, I'll take my sailboat out and fire up the chart plotter that is connected to AIS transmitter and receiver. And that way, my course, location, and speed is transmitted over VHF to vessels in the local area. The vessels in the local area will see that on their chart plotter and notify them if there's going to be an imminent collision, for example, and a bunch of other kind of parameters that are surrounding that. From AIS gets its data from GPS. That's how it knows kind of where it is on the planet, and it uses calculation based on that data to figure out course, and speed. So that when it transmits the heading information and the speed information to the surrounding vessels over VHF, so we're looking at, what is it, Larry, 10 miles for,
I think so.
Rough line of sight to the horizon. It's 16 kilometers, so that should be about 10 miles, in freedom units. With regard to what we see here is we see them especially around the port of Shanghai doing this. Now, there are many reasons why that could be happening, right? It's certainly unknown motivation, right? But let's just say that you were trying to track a specific shipping container within the port of Shanghai. Well, this would make it very difficult to do. There are many governments around the world that ship things and put them essentially on hold in different ports for when they need them. This could be a way to essentially elude the precise location of those within that area in the port, for example. It might be, as is alluded here, a potential to thwart smuggling or illegal mining on the river. It could be something to deter piracy, right? So that pirates couldn't rely on the GPS signal. But the problem is with some of those theories, for example, is that, well, if the pirates can't rely on the GPS signal, neither can the shipping captains. I've only seen video footage of your chart plotters as you come into, let's say, the port of Shanghai or the port of Singapore, for example. And even with all of that assisted navigation, it would be an absolute nightmare to navigate. I couldn't even imagine without it, and or if that data was wrong or incorrect. Just as a side note, that's one of the things that we're really concerned about here in the Pacific Northwest with our shipping, is having an electronic warfare range that is jamming signals, spoofing signals, and other things so close to one of our most important shipping channels, and it's shared between the US and Canada. Same thing for the port of Shanghai. It definitely points to something unusual going on. We don't know what it is. We've also been able to confirm the GPS, confirm the GPS spoofing through things like Strava, for example. You can see essentially areas of kind of bloom of data outside of the general clusters, which shows you that there's been deviation in that direct area. Over to you, Larry.
We can make a little animated GIF going on there. So,
indeed.
All right. So yeah, thinking back to how easy it is for some civilians to do this, a couple commands here using GPS SDR sim with a HackRF. You need to effectively calculate your time and/or position based on I can't pronounce it. So we're going to ephemerides. There we go. Effectively, the knowledge of where the satellites are to generate the signal coming from L1 to be able to either manipulate time and or location. It generates a transmission, which then you play back with HackRF transfer. It's quite simple for us as civilians to be able to do some GPS spoofing over short distances. So we can do the same things that nation states can do over much smaller distances, and it's now something within the realm of things that we can do. Mike and I were talking about some of this type of stuff, and the question came up of, well, clearly they have these folks with lots of motivation, the CADS project with the University of Texas and various other nation state capability for detecting when GPS is being messed with. The problem is there's no method for civilians to be able to detect GPS fuckery. So how do we do that? There's been a couple of projects out there to deal with the GPS health. One of them is Galmon, which monitors the signals from the satellites themselves to interpret how they're reporting their health. So it's not the same sort of data. And in speaking with the Galmon folks, that there has been some of this data available, but it's been largely in academia and of those projects for University of Texas and CADS, which I'm just not privy to.
Yep, and just as a little side note, definitely go check out the Galmon project. It was started literally 2 weeks before we announced our project, which is awesome, or at least they went public with their data. It was put together by a friend of mine, Bert Hubert, in Holland. Brilliant guy, used to work with Fox IT over there in the Netherlands. As Larry said, it's really focused on the health of the GNSS satellites and their signal. So if they start to identify drift, for example, or a natural change in gain, for example, from those satellites, they can confer with the folks that are managing these satellites to see, if the signal is degrading, if that satellite has to be retired and or replaced. What we're more interested in is, well, is there GPS fuckery going on, or even time signal fuckery going on, and how can we detect it? How can you or I detect it, opposed to waiting for some massively large funded project, from a government agency, for example, to detect it and or tell us about it.
Exactly.
When we started getting into this, we were like, okay, well, let's build one. How hard could this be, Larry?
Well, turns out it actually wasn't too bad, but we had lots of help. So as part of this keynote, Mike?
I was just going to say, we're calling this project WaiLin, and this is after a character in a wonderful James Bond movie, and where GPS fuckery was definitely introduced to the public. When I called Larry up and I said, hey, we should do this. It would be an interesting research project. We have a couple locations around where we could potentially pick up some of this kind of manipulation of that signal. And one other thing about the signal manipulation that we didn't mention is I mentioned about the truck companies trying to monitor their trucks over GPS and everything else. Well, in the United States, that literally is the most common use for manipulating GPS signal is done by the truckers. So if you live next to a highway, definitely put together a WaiLin sensor and start detecting when those trucks are going by and spoofing their location signals. Definitely interesting. So, Larry, why don't you take it away?
Absolutely. Mike and I talked about this and researched what it would take to do some detection. And we put this together with some help. Mike and I were definitely some idea guys and put some skin in the game technically. But we couldn't have done the WaiLin project without the help of our full-time security analyst and developer, Faith, at InGuardians. A huge thanks to Faith, who was up until about 4 a.m. this morning putting together the final release for WaiLin and knocking down some of the last little bits. She's on Pacific time, so she will be up soon, and we'll be finishing the final upload as part of the Wild West Hackin Fest release for WaiLin, including a full Raspberry Pi image for you to just burn to microSD and have a full running system and not having to do any of the manual install methods. What we wanted to do with WaiLin is to provide an inexpensive, expandable, open source platform for citizens to be able to approach and monitor for GPS fuckery. Using and comparing the ability for us to receive from multiple GNSS platforms, whether specifically here in the US, we can get Galileo, GLONASS, and GPS. So our initial development platforms feature 3 different GPS receivers only receiving signals from those satellites, in which we can compare and contrast the location on those in case only one of them is being spoofed. You can find the project on GitHub in the WaiLin repository. And there's also an Amazon wish list with all of the parts, including the extra stuff that we'll be implementing in the future. Currently using a Raspberry Pi 4 with 2 RTL SDRs for the future ADS-B and AIS reception so that we can compare and contrast those to what is being received from GPS. We can also include more of those for doing other time sources for comparing time, such as WWVB. And we're currently using 3 satellite navigation receivers, the U-Blox 8Ms, with serial to TTL converters. And our current setup here for the US is GPS GLONASS on Galileo. And if you're in someplace else on the planet, you can configure those GPS receivers to use other systems. And will give us the ability to have multiple inputs from that data. Currently, we're taking all of that data as gathered by the GPS units and ingesting them once daily into a local influx DB instance, which we then post-process once daily with Grafana, which generates some nice visualizations that we see here on the slide. And then if there's anything sort of outside of 2 standard deviations for what we'd expect or distance at a fixed locations, it currently sends some alerts to your own configurable Discord server and channel. But it's extensible, so we can create additional methods later, whether it be email, SMS text, all sorts of these other things. And on the right is a picture of actually the station that is behind me, stuck up against my window. This one happens to be when we had it deployed in Seattle for some initial testing. Inexpensive to build, fairly small, and all sorts of other fun stuff. But Mike, tell us about where we want to take it on the future.
Absolutely. And one of the things that was so cool about just the simple platform that Larry came up with there is that it is expandable, or even kind of make it smaller. We're just giving you an example of kind of what we did. Right now, our next stages are going to be to put together a site for WaiLin so that other people can essentially create accounts and upload their own data so that we can have kind of a global view of where these sensors are and what they're detecting, if they're detecting an event, and have some capability to be able to push out alerts when we're noticing these particular events. I made a little joke here for Johannes Ulrich, D-Shield here, but for GPS. So DShield was essentially the original gatherer of intrusion detection data that became the Storm Center. We also want to add some additional support, as Larry mentioned, for ADSB and AIS, just to see, for example, when we detect a GPS deviation, do we see it on either AIS, so that'll be surface of the water, essentially, or ADSB, which is coming technically from aircraft. So if we see ADSB that isn't changing, but AIS that is changing, we can get a general idea of kind of the power of the transmission and the scale of the fuckery.
And some other things too, for some additional receipt of time-based stuff, we can use all of the various RF-based time sources, WWV here in the US and a bunch of others across the planet for over-the-horizon time synchronization, such as those RF-enabled time clocks and so forth. We also want to do a little bit better alerting methods, either locally or through the quote global reporting engine, so that we can support additional platforms. Discord happened to be quite easy for us to get set up as a sample to show how we're doing it, or it can be done. And then we're currently using batch processing for the alerting. So we'd like to be able to make that so it's more real time, so that as soon as it happens, you can potentially get a text message as opposed to getting a text message at midnight to say that it happened at some point over the last 24 hours. So Mike, how can they help?
The biggest thing would be to go out and get yourself a copy of the code or the distro and set up a sensor, and also help out with ideas or code to help build out the essentially the reporting engine. That's the big next heavy lift.
We've got something that you can monitor your own, but we want to definitely improve the sharing and effectively crowdsourcing the detection of GPS fuckery. But this is a keynote. So we talked about some technical things, and we really want to sort of get everybody together at the end of this and realize that this problem is so much larger than just GPS, and to sort of provide a call to action. We thought about this from the perspective of GPS. What happens when someone messes with this unauthenticated signal that can affect time and or location? The problem is that in our daily lives and in our enterprises, we're reliant on so many other sources of unauthenticated RF transmissions. And what happens when people start screwing with those other signals that we blindly trust, whether that be GSM or television or FM radio with data transmission with RDS, stuff on 433 megahertz. I'm seeing in Discord VOR and ILS for flight control. There are so many things that we've become reliant on as a society for magic RF that we have no ability to detect. We've become reliant on, and it's unauthenticated. So where's the next fuckery going to happen from an RF perspective? Think about what those other transmissions that we're reliant on for our organizations, and they may be transmissions we don't even know about right now, but they're still there. And think about how manipulation of those would impact your organization. And then think about how we can go build detection mechanism, because this problem is larger than GPS. We really need to step up our detection game for all of these signals as a society so that we can protect ourselves for things that we've become reliant on. So that's sort of our challenge to you as the listener, is to take this to the next step. Think about all these other systems. And Mike, did you sort of have any final words on this one as well?
Yeah, you might be thinking to yourselves like, hey, I'm not on a sailboat or I'm not in an urban situation. I'm out in farm country somewhere. Well, just remember, what do you think those large combines set their borders to? Oh, right, GPS signal and GPS posts in the ground. That ought to make you sleep well at night. But definitely, go out there, think of these things, figure out a way that we can bring the detection of that manipulation to the civilian population.
Absolutely. And to that, we've talked about in other venues about creating FM radio signals with some other projects. And it's very difficult for organizations to detect that their RF environment has changed, because there isn't a lot of detection mechanisms now, and we've become reliant on them, that we now need to become reliant on detection systems for when they change. So we've got 1 minute left. Apparently my slides have gone away. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out with us.
And
I'm also hanging out in Discord.
Yep. And that's what I was going to say. If you guys have any questions, please join the Discord channel. Mike and Larry will be in there, and just address your questions directly to them in the Discord channel. That would be fantastic. And I think that